The greatest crisis of the modern soul is the search for an identity that has already been given. We live in an age characterized by ceaseless self-discovery, yet we remain perpetually lost. We are told to look inward, to look outward, to define ourselves by our achievements, our desires, or our social roles. Yet the deep, abiding sense of belonging remains elusive. This profound, universal restlessness is not a psychological aberration of the 21st century. It is the defining feature of human existence, articulated with unparalleled clarity 16 centuries ago by Saint Augustine of Hippo. He diagnosed the human condition with a single, devastatingly simple sentence that stands as the foundational thesis of all Christian anthropology. This is the Augustinian postulate of the restless heart. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. This is not a lament, it is an ontological description. The heart's restlessness is not a flaw in our design, but the defining feature of its structure, serving as an internal compass pointing irrevocably toward the Creator. We are built with an infinite capacity, and anything finite that attempts to fill it will inevitably fail. The philosophical implication of this postulate is vast. It means that the human being is inherently a creature in motion, driven by a desire for ultimate fulfillment. If we deny the source of that motion, we do not stop moving. We merely misdirect the energy, spending our lives searching for the divine within the domain of the created. The core tragedy of the human experience, Augustine argues, is the paradox of self-exile. We are searching for identity and rest in places where the self cannot exist in its ultimate God-intended form. We stand outside the true self, seeking the divine essence in the mutable world. Augustine vividly captures this error in his famous lament. I was outside myself and sought you there, and in my unlovely state I plunged into those lovely created things which you made. This is the image of the soul wandering far from home, mistaking the signpost for the destination. The beauty of the world is real, but it is a derivative beauty, a shadow of the ultimate good. When we treat the shadow as the substance, we condemn ourselves to endless dissatisfaction. This search for the eternal in the temporal leads us down four vain pursuits, which Augustine systematically critiques as the world's false idols for the soul's identity. These pursuits are not merely bad habits. They are fundamental errors in metaphysical valuation. The first vain pursuit is temporal pleasure, which Augustine terms voluptas. This is the unrelenting pursuit of bodily and sensual satisfaction, the definition of the self by the intensity of its immediate experience. The modern world tells us that if we maximize comfort and minimize pain, we will find happiness. Augustine observed that this path provides only fleeting joy, which immediately gives way to deeper misery. The soul becomes tethered by the love of things that cannot last, and then is agonized to lose them. The physical pleasure passes, leaving the soul empty, demanding the next gratification, trapping the person in a cycle of craving and loss. True rest cannot be found in something that, by its very nature, is designed to dissolve the moment it is consumed. The second false identity is worldly ambition, encapsulated in the pursuit of gloria and honor. This is the search for the self in reputation, power, titles, and the esteem of other people. We define ourselves by what others think of us, believing that if we accumulate enough social capital, we will be complete. This ambition is a profound error because it is ultimately a love of one's own opinion reflected back by others, and the pride in their blindness of other men. It makes the soul dependent on the fickle judgment of the crowd, turning identity into a fragile, mutable thing that can be destroyed by a whisper or a slight shift in public favor. The love of honor is the love of a shadow of virtue, not virtue itself. The third pursuit is material possessions, or Divitiae. This error involves valuing mutable goods, wealth, property, and physical security, over the immutable good, which is God Himself. The soul attempts to secure itself by accumulating what is external and changeable, A life defined by consumption is a life defined by fear. The more the soul possesses, the more it has to lose, leading to anxiety and avarice. Augustine recognized that these goods, while useful for temporal life, are wrongly ordered when they become the ultimate end of existence. They are burdens, not anchors, and they can never satisfy the part of the soul designed for the infinite. The final vain pursuit is intellectual pride, or philosophia secularis. This is the attempt to grasp eternal truth solely through human reason, without the necessary humility of faith and grace. Augustine understood this deeply, having spent years immersed in Manichaean and Neoplatonist philosophies. He found these pursuits to be intellectually beautiful, offering tantalizing glimpses of the truth, but ultimately empty because they lacked the power to transform the will. The proud intellect elevates its own capacity above the source of all being, leading to a woe to my proud soul, which sees the light, but refuses to walk in it. Reason is a necessary tool, but it is insufficient for salvation or true self-knowledge without the aid of revelation. These four pursuits collectively define the soul's condition of self-exile. They are all expressions of sin as disordered love, or aversio a Deo. Augustine defines sin not primarily as a list of actions, but as a condition of misdirected affection. Choosing lower goods, the creatures, over the supreme good, the Creator. The soul turns away from God and toward itself and the created world. This turning is an act of the will. Augustine makes it clear that the soul is not moved to abandon higher things and love inferior things unless it wills to do so. Sin is not a substance that attacks us. It is a choice to love what is less than worthy of our ultimate devotion. This concept requires a sharp theological distinction. Augustine had to refute the Manichaean error, which taught that evil was an eternal substance locked in battle with good. If evil were a substance, God would either be limited, unable to destroy it, or imperfect, the source of it. Augustine clarified that evil is not an eternal substance, but a privatio boni, a privation or corruption of goodness. The created world is fundamentally good because God made it. Its goodness, however, is corruptible because it is created and changeable. The problem is never the object, a beautiful object or a useful possession, but the soul's love for that object as if it were the ultimate end, replacing God. To understand the scope of this disordered identity, Augustine provides the framework of the city of man versus the city of God. These are not geographical locations, but two spiritual communities defined by their ultimate loves. The city of man is united by a common object of temporal, self-centered love, the love of self even to the contempt of God. Any virtues practiced within this city, such as civic duty or justice, when detached from the purpose of God, are in reality vices rather than virtues. They are self-serving acts of pride that reinforce the false, worldly identity. The city of God, by contrast, is united by the love of God even to the contempt of self. This framework shows that the identity we seek in the world, in politics, commerce, or culture, is fundamentally unstable because it rests upon a foundation of disordered, passing affections. If the world cannot define us, where then is the true locus of identity? We must shift our gaze from the external chaos to the internal architecture of the human spirit. Part 2 begins the profound introspection necessary for true self-knowledge. The unique Christian anthropology of Augustine asserts that the true identity of the soul is not in its external actions or relationships, but in its internal structure as the Imago Dei, the image of the triune God. This doctrine separates Christian self-understanding from all secular philosophy. We do not find ourselves by creating a self. We find ourselves by recognizing the pre-existing divine stamp impressed upon our being. We are reflections, not originals. Augustine locates the seat of the image specifically in the highest part of the soul, which he calls the rational mind, or mens, intellect. This is the part that is capable of him, meaning it possesses the unique capacity to know, remember, and love the eternal God. It is set over all irrational creation, making us unique among all earthly beings. In his monumental work, De Trinitate, Augustine seeks to understand the incomprehensible mystery of the Trinity by looking inward. He discovers the primary Trinitarian analogy, or the vestigia Trinitatis, the traces of the Trinity that mirror the divine structure within the human mind itself. This analogy is built upon three inseparable faculties that constitute one single life. They are distinct activities, yet they operate as an indivisible unity, reflecting the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The first faculty is memory, or memoria. This is not just the recollection of past events, but the mind's profound, self-aware knowledge of its own existence. The simple, unshakable realization, I am. It is the constant presence of the self to the self, forming the stable ground of identity. The second faculty is understanding, or intelligentia. This is the mind's active knowledge of itself. It is the awareness that I know. The intellect seeks to grasp the nature of the self that remembers and exists. It is the inner word, the internal articulation of the self's being. The third faculty is will or love, voluntas. This is the mind's movement toward itself and its knowledge, the active choice to affirm its own existence and understanding. The realization, I will. This love binds the memory and understanding together, completing the inner structure. These three, being, knowing, and loving, are the foundation of the image. But Augustine recognizes that this inner trinity is only a trace, a potential. When these faculties are turned inward upon themselves, they simply reflect the self, a beautiful but ultimately finite image. The mind's true perfection of the image is achieved only when these three faculties are rightly ordered toward the Creator. This forms the higher Trinitarian analogy, where the self transcends its own finitude. The memory is perfected when it becomes the memory of God, not just recollection, but the capacity to contain God, the inner word of the eternal Creator. We remember God because we were made from Him and for Him. The understanding is perfected when it becomes the understanding of God, participation in the eternal and immutable wisdom of God. Our intellect is meant to grasp the truth that is outside of time, the truth that is Christ Himself. Finally, the will is perfected when it becomes the love of God, the will directed to the supreme good. Augustine states that the only true source of true happiness is to rejoice in the truth, for to rejoice in the truth is to rejoice in you, O God, who are the truth. When the will loves God supremely, the soul achieves its intended purpose and finds rest. This internal structure is the foundation of identity, yet the human soul is constantly confused because of its entanglement in the mutable flow of time. Augustine dedicates an entire book of his Confessions, Book 11, to the philosophy of time, recognizing that the problem of temporal identity is central to our confusion. We fragment ourselves across the dimensions of time. We live in the past through nostalgia and regret, memory. We live in the future through ambition and anxiety, expectation. And we barely touch the present, which is an infinitely small, fleeting point, direct experience. Augustine concludes that time is not an external reality, a river flowing independently of us. Time is an extension of the soul's attention, what he called distentio animi, the distension or stretching out of the mind. The soul measures time. It does not contain it. Therefore, the identity sought in the past or the future is a self-imposed fragmentation. We are scattering our true self across moments that do not exist, except as impressions in our mind. The only true point of rest is the eternal present of God, which is the unchangeable and all-changing Creator. The soul finds its anchor by directing its attention from the distentio, distension, fragmentation, to the intentio, intention, focus on God, the eternal word, verbum. When we focus on the eternal, our fragmented identity begins to coalesce into a stable whole. This necessitates the critical path to identity, the command of introspection. Augustine urges us, noli foras ire inter ipsum redi, Do not wish to go outside, return into yourself. The self is a mirror, and the one it seeks is within the mind's depths. We must turn away from the noise of the world and enter the hidden sanctuary of the soul where the image of God resides. However, this introspection is only the first step. It is the beginning of the journey, not the end. The deepest part of the soul is merely the capacity for the divine. We turn inward only to realize we must turn outward and upward to the one who fills that capacity. We have explored the foundational restlessness of the soul and the divine architecture that houses our true identity. The journey outlined by Augustine is rigorous, demanding a complete reorientation of the self away from worldly idols and toward the inner sanctuary of the mind. If you find yourself captivated by this profound intellectual and spiritual journey, the intense personal struggle to reconcile human weakness with divine truth, then there is one resource that serves as the ultimate map for this terrain. This is the very essence of Augustinian thought captured in his own words. It is the book where he first articulated the cry of the restless heart and detailed his own painful path from self-exile to divine rest. I am speaking of the Confessions of Saint Augustine. This is not simply a historical document. It is a fundamental spiritual autobiography that describes Augustine's personal path from paganism and Manichaeism to Christianity. It is a raw, honest, and philosophically dense meditation on the themes we are discussing: sin, grace, memory, and desire. Reading the Confessions allows you to witness the birth of Western philosophical theology, tracing the exact moments where Augustine struggled with the emptiness of worldly ambition and the bondage of his own will. It provides the context for his later theological works and is the most accessible entry point into his genius. If you wish to deepen your understanding of why you can never find yourself in the world, you must read the story of the man who first articulated that truth. You can find a link to this essential text in the description below. Now, having established the true locus of identity within the soul's architecture, we must confront the final and perhaps most difficult aspect of Augustine's theology: the inability of the soul to perfect itself. Part 3 addresses the great obstacle, the fallen will and the denial of self-sufficiency. It is one thing to know where the true self resides. It is another thing entirely to possess the power to move toward it. The greatest temptation to the modern soul is the Pelagian heresy, which argues that the soul can find its true identity and perfection through its own unaided effort. This heresy, named after the British monk Pelagius, is perhaps the most pervasive and subtle error in contemporary spirituality. The Pelagian thesis holds that sin is merely a habit, and that man's will is as free after the fall as it was before it. Therefore, perfection is possible and obligatory through sheer human effort alone. If we try hard enough, if we follow the right moral code, we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps and achieve the identity we desire. Augustine's response to this is definitive and devastating. He insists that the will is fundamentally wounded by original sin, leading to a state where the soul is incapable of following God's commands or loving God without divine assistance. The soul is not merely imperfect, it is in bondage to concupiscence, the disordering of desires. The human will still possesses freedom of choice, but it has lost the freedom to choose rightly its ultimate end without grace. We are constantly pulled toward lesser goods, even when we know better. Augustine experienced this division acutely, describing his famous internal struggle. My inner self was a house divided against itself. The mind commands the body, and the body obeys immediately. But when the mind commands itself, it meets resistance. The intellect knows what is good, but the will, wounded and fragmented, struggles against the command. This internal division proves the Pelagian ideal of a self-sufficient will to be a philosophical fantasy. We cannot simply decide to be whole. The effort to find identity through willpower alone merely leads to greater frustration and a deeper sense of alienation from the self we know we ought to be. This leads to the insufficiency of law and virtue. The law, whether the Mosaic law, natural law, or any moral code, is essential, but it reveals the soul's inability. It does not provide the power to overcome it. The law functions like a mirror, showing us the dirt on our faces, but it cannot wash the dirt away. The search for self-identity through moral perfection or keeping the law is a project doomed to failure, because it often becomes a form of pride. It is a virtue that aims at self-justification, seeking to earn an identity that must instead be received as a gift. Augustine teaches that without grace, even our most laudable virtues are ultimately tainted by self-love, reinforcing the city of man. If we cannot create our own identity, we must look to the source of the original image for restoration. The true identity found is realized only through renewal in Christ. The ultimate identity of the soul is a participation in the perfect image of God, who is Jesus Christ. Christ is the eternal Word, the perfect expression of the Father, and therefore the perfect archetype of the image. The human soul is an image of the image, and our restoration means being molded back into conformity with the original pattern. St. Paul describes the necessary restoration in Colossians 3:10. Put on the new man, who is being renewed unto the knowledge of God, according to the image of his Creator. This renewal is not a superficial change of habits, but a deep ontological transformation. The primary battlefield for this renewal is the mind, as stated in Romans 12:2. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This transformation is what restores the soul's intellect and directs its love back to its true source. Only when the mind is renewed by grace can the internal trinity of memory, understanding, and will function as intended, focused on God rather than the self. This brings us to the critical theological concept, the role of grace as liberator. Grace is not merely an external aid, a bonus for those who try hard, the Pelagian view. Grace is the internal liberating power that restores the will's fundamental capacity to love God supremely. The soul cannot simply choose its identity. It must be given the power to choose its true end. Grace heals the wound of original sin, allowing the will to desire the supreme good over lower, mutable goods. It is the divine physician restoring the broken architecture of the soul. The theological crux of the debate between Augustine and Pelagius is summarized in Augustine's famous prayer, which Pelagius found utterly offensive. Give what you command what you will. This prayer summarizes the soul's utter dependence on God's grace for its own moral and ontological fulfillment. We cannot obey the divine command to love perfectly unless God first provides the grace to make that love possible. Identity is not a self-made garment. It is a gift received through transformation. The entire Augustinian journey from the restless heart to the restored will points toward the final rest, the beatific vision. The true and final identity of the soul is not found in time, but in the eschatological consummation of the soul in God. This rest is the fulfillment of the Imago Dei, the copy's full share in its model. It is the moment when the fragmented temporal self is made whole in the eternal presence of truth. St. Paul, whose words Augustine often echoed, describes this ultimate state. We now see God through a mirror dimly, but then face to face. The search for self ends only when the self sees its creator clearly. Because in seeing God, the soul finally understands its own reflection perfectly. This is the ultimate resolution of the restless heart. The identity crisis that plagues humanity is fundamentally a theological and philosophical one, not merely a psychological one. We are dealing with a design problem. The soul is designed for the infinite, and all finite substitutes must necessarily fail, leaving behind only the echo of unmet desire. The Augustinian journey provides the only viable map out of this confusion. It is the path of the inward turn and the upward gaze. The deep introspection into the soul's Trinitarian structure is essential, but when that structure is fully explored, it points beyond itself to its archetype. We must listen to the restlessness not as a signal of our failure, but as a perpetual reminder of our divine origin. It is the voice of the infinite within the finite. The true path to self-discovery is recognizing that you are not self-created, but God-created. To find yourself is to stop trying to invent yourself and start trying to conform yourself to the image that was given to you from the beginning. The true self is the self rightly ordered in love. The ultimate resolution to the human search is the surrender of the search itself. The restlessness of the heart is a divine gift, a perpetual yearning that prevents the soul from settling for anything less than its maker. The search for self ends only when the self is fully given over to the one for whom it was made. The moment of rest is the moment of recognition, that the identity we sought in the distant future or the external world was always already present, deep within the soul, waiting to be illuminated by grace. If these words speak to you, you're not here by chance. Subscribe, like, and share your thoughts below. Each simple action helps this message reach more hearts and reminds me that this work still has meaning.